Hi everyone, today we're looking at a vision that Peter receives. At noon on the following day, Peter went up to the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted to eat. While others were preparing the meal, he had a visionary experience. He saw heaven opened up and something like a large linen sheet being lowered to the earth by its four corners. Inside the sheet were all kinds of four-legged animals, reptiles, and wild birds. And a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Peter exclaimed, "Absolutely not, Lord. I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke a second time, "Never consider unclean what God has made pure." This happened 3 times, and then the object was suddenly pulled back into heaven. So we're seeing here Peter's being challenged in his beliefs about the kosher food laws from the law of Moses. I won't spend a lot of time getting into those, but it basically restricted what Jewish people could eat or not eat. Some things were clean and some things were unclean. And, when we hear these stories, we think of this as somehow exciting, and those laws are just restrictive. And so we think, well, Peter, this is great news. You can eat pork and bacon and lobster now. But to put it more, to understand how Peter would have heard this, it would be like if God told you, hey, go and eat these dogs and bats and crickets. No thanks, Lord, right? We do the same thing. It's triggering this feeling of disgust. Disgust is actually one of our foundational emotions. And even if we can't explain it, it often comes into these sort of things. These categories of clean and unclean, they weren't really intended to be moral categories. But that is something that kind of happens over time, that you start assigning some things as good and some things as bad, not just clean and unclean. The real challenge that Peter faces here is, he's basically saying, God, I can't do what you're telling me to do because that goes against what you've told me to do. Right? You can understand the conundrum that he's in. And, I remember often hearing people say, well, God will never ask you to do something that goes against Scripture. Well, Scripture itself shows that sometimes it's not that simple. When are we really following God, and when are we actually just responding to feelings of disgust? The central question as we're figuring these things out comes down to love, right? Does this make me more loving or less loving? Or is this actually not even matter? Right? I would argue that food laws are actually pretty irrelevant to the idea of love. Now, as we'll see tomorrow, this vision isn't really about food. It's about people. So, who triggers your feelings of disgust? And are you using God somehow to justify that feeling? Like Peter, are we calling what or who God has made pure unclean? Can we do what God says, following the promptings of Christ and the Spirit, even when it challenges what we think God says?